The 1920s were a time of cultural upheaval and change. In the United States, an economic boom. In Britain, political change. In Ireland, however, things were different. Having just won a guerrilla war for independence against Britain in 1921 and established a new government of Ireland, this decade was the bloodiest one, perhaps, in their entire history. One of the men that fought in this war was an army captain named Edward Mortimer Bacon, a descendant of the famed Elizabethan philosopher Francis Bacon. He would go on to marry a wealthy coal mine and steel business heiress named Christina Winnie Frith, and had 5 children, one named Francis Bacon that later became one of Britain's most famous artists to date. He was born in 1908 on October 28th in Dublin, Ireland. His family often worked with the military and trained horses for both leisure and war. Ironically, he was born gravely allergic to them, alongside suffering from asthma. Bacon was incredibly shy and effeminate as a child, which angered his father greatly. He was thought to have been frequently horsewhipped by their hired stable hands. The Bacon family frequently moved, having lived in dozens of houses between Ireland and Britain. Shortly after the War of Independence, they moved back to Ireland and, at last, settled. During this time, at a party at his mother's family's house, he'd shown up wearing American flapper attire, complete with a beaded dress, lipstick, and heels. Later, he'd be kicked out of his home by his father for another similar incident, kick-starting his adult life. Bacon would go on to spend the later 20s in London, having to survive on petty theft and tax fraud because his own mother's trust fund and his own wage only equaled to €8 a week. Within London's queer underworld, he learned to take advantage of the wealthy men that pursued him, and was able to save enough to move to Berlin. His father had arranged for a friend to accompany him there to try and, quote, iron out his son's effeminacy. However, they had ironically begun having an affair whilst on the trip. This was when he would be exposed to the famous art halls and exhibitions of Paris, becoming inspired by Nicolas Poussin's Massacre of the Innocents. In 1929, he moved back to London and got a studio to begin work as an interior designer and painter, sharing the apartment with 3 people, one including the man's partner, Eric Hall, married to a woman at the time. In 1933, he painted his first work, Crucifixion, a surrealist oil painting depicting the crucifixion of Jesus. This work was greatly criticized by other artists in London, and its sister pieces, alongside many other works, were destroyed by Bacon out of shame. Despite later being disowned by the painter, this work, and other similar ones also detailing crucifixion, were crucial in forming the man's surreal and jarring art style. Bacon frequently moved studios, at last moving in with the aforementioned partner, who would later go on to arrange several art shows for Bacon, because the International Surrealist Exhibition refused to show his work for it somehow not being surreal enough. In 1937, Bacon showed 3 works: Figures in a Garden, Abstraction from the Human Form, and Seated Figure. Because these 3 were either destroyed or rejected by London's art societies in the case of Figures in a Garden, these works have little known about them and only photographs remaining. 3 years later, his father would die and Bacon was named his sole executor of his will. When World War II rolled around, Bacon was declared unfit for duty, instead volunteering in London's air raid precautions. After the city was bombed, he was discharged for his worsening asthma caused by the fine dust. He and Eric Hall rented a cottage as the war raged on, finally able to return to painting. In that cottage, he painted a figure getting out of a car. Later on, he painted over it and renamed it Landscape with a Car, referenced allegedly from a photo of Adolf Hitler. In 1944, Bacon began to become wildly successful. He painted 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, referencing Picasso's works alongside his own earlier paintings. This work was a sensation throughout London when it was shown. Curiously, modern X-ray analysis has shown that before this work was created, it was actually a portrait of his lover, Eric. His most famous work, simply named Painting, created in 1946, was shown throughout Europe with Bacon traveling alongside it, falling into deep debt once it had reached Monte Carlo because he'd become obsessed with gambling. Around this time is when Eric and Bacon were thought to have ended their relationship, though Hall remained incredibly successful and influential to Bacon, noted to have left his wife and kids as well. Bacon continued to travel, at one point visiting Egypt and then South Africa, where his mother lived, where the nature there greatly inspired his later works. In 1951, he returned to have found that his childhood nanny and lifelong companion, Jessie Lightfoot, had died. He soon sold his home, and his paintings had begun to take a much darker turn. In 1963, Bacon would meet someone who had become a frequent subject in his works, George Dyer, who was rumored to have met Bacon whilst robbing his apartment. The man came from a family of crime and was an alcoholic. Soon, they became close. However, Dyer's novelty to Bacon and his circle had begun to diminish, and the man began to grow bitter. He said that he enjoyed the attention in many of Bacon's paintings, but thought the works themselves were ugly. In 1971, they were no longer together, and only shared occasional contact. During this time, Bacon was often described as London's greatest painter. Dyer had tried to get the man's attention numerous times by planting cannabis in his flat and threatening suicide. Later, Francis had been informed that Dyer had died of overdose and become stricken with grief. He made several more works of Dyer, painting about his suicide and life before, slowly breaking down more and more as the years went on. In 1992, he was admitted to a hospital as his asthma worsened. He'd later die of a heart attack at the age of 82, and his estate was bequeathed to his heir, John Edwards. Today, Francis Bacon is still a much beloved artist. A site named francisbacon.com seeks to continue his memory and forgotten works, alongside the artist's rich history and personal details. Bacon will continue to be commemorated as one of the greatest painters of his time, and, frankly, one of my favorites.